Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to On Your Radar. I'm your host for On Your Radar, Don India, and I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with industry experts tackling critical topics in the areas around data privacy, corporate compliance, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. And our guest today spans the gamut with all of these topics that we're going to be talking about. So let me set the stage for you and introduce our guest. Early in his career, he was a healthcare litigator. After a successful 6-year run, he transitioned to a practicing privacy attorney, representing hospitals, healthcare systems, and healthcare providers. He then spent the next 11 years at GE Healthcare out of Chicago, Illinois, one of my favorite cities and my hometown, ultimately concluding his final 6 years there as a chief privacy officer and data protection counsel. Now, he is the senior vice president and deputy general counsel of trust and privacy at Hewlett-Packard, where he leads HP's trust and privacy organization, defining and driving the global data privacy and governance, legal and compliance strategy for the company. Nestor Rivera, welcome to On Your Radar.
Thank you, Don. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, I appreciate it. Appreciate the conversation we'll have today. But before we jump into our critical topics that we're going to be discussing, our audience loves to hear about our guests' journeys. Can you take our audience through how you arrived at where you are today?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I went to law school thinking I wanted to be a labor and employment lawyer. And so when I went to my second summer associate role, I specifically was targeting the labor and employment department for an offer right after law school. And, much like any law firm in the summer associate program, you have to go through the different rotations. And one of them happened to be the health law section of the firm. And there was a focus that summer on HIPAA because it had just been passed, a couple of years prior, and companies were now starting to figure out, do we need to come into compliance with this thing and how do we do so? And so some of my assignments that summer were in that space. When I went back to law school for my third year, I actually ended up doing a seminar in health law where my final paper was on HIPAA. And so when I went back to the law firm, I started doing more of that work. And at the same time, as you mentioned, being a litigator, that was, taking up most of my work because privacy just wasn't a thing back then. This was in the year 2000. So we're talking 24 years ago. Mm-hmm. But as things would have it, there was a breach that came into the company, not healthcare, but I was the only person that had, some sort of, knowledge of what privacy was all about. And so that's really how privacy started for me was dealing with that data breach. And then over time, other companies experienced them. By the time I went to my second firm, as you mentioned, it was primarily the focus of my practice, expanded it beyond healthcare, to include financial services and other industries. And, by that point, privacy was really catching on, right? Because, the EU is starting to contemplate a future after the EU directive and transitioning to GDPR. And so by the time I went to GE Healthcare, it was all I did. And over time, we started in privacy, but then cybersecurity became a big thing. And then, most recently in the last 5 years, AI became a big thing. So, being the person that had experience with data, those other areas started getting added to my role. And I would say, though, that really my current role at HP is the culmination of all of those at a very high level, because, I would tell you that 50% of my time right now is spent on AI. Now, the interesting piece of that is that privacy has a huge intersect with that. So it's not like I'm not doing privacy, but the AI component and the AI governance component of it is taking an awful lot of my time right now.
No, I can absolutely imagine that. And the path that you've taken into privacy, many of our guests have taken the similar path where they were the only and unique ones with the privacy ability to analyze a critical event. And as they progress, much like you, other things have evolved into their overall repertoire of what they have to accomplish and what they have to be responsible for. Well, that's actually a great opportunity to segue, Nestor, into our topic of conversation, which is really around evolving regulations and how technology has and will continue to play roles in the reduction of enterprise risk as these regulations continue to evolve. So my question for you as we start the conversation, Nestor, is tell us about your experiences that you have with this evolving regulations and the history you have with technology and how it has it bridged and created the efficiencies. And then we'll get into a little bit of future state conversation.
Yeah, so let me approach this from kind of a broad perspective in two buckets. One
Please.
is just like the evolutions of the laws over the years, and then I think the other piece is responding to incidents, in the face of those, laws that now exist that maybe didn't 20 years ago, and they're very related, I think. So, not surprisingly, in the past, say, when I first started this 2 decades ago, everything was super manual, right? You found out about these proposed laws just because they got printed in some magazine or some bar newspaper or something of the nature, right? And you ended up doing a lot of reading. And I even recall reaching out to a bunch of legislators when I was in Florida, wanting to know what, kind of what the discussions were behind the scenes so I could get some intent to how they meant these things to apply. And so, everything was super manual. You always felt like you were missing something because there was just way too much going on and you had to search for it. And, similarly, when you had a breach, particularly if it was a breach that entailed, multiple states, right, where you had individuals at issue that were in all these states, you literally had to pull all of these laws one by one, read them, shepherdize them, right? For those of you that are used to just clicking a button now, you literally had to pull books from the library
Right.
and follow case law and see if it was still valid and what have you. And so, it was a very time consuming process. Now, of course, in private practice, that was great for me because that meant a bunch of billable hours that I could,
Of
put on a
course.
case.
Of course.
But
Yeah.
if you think about that in terms of the very short timeframes that we have currently to respond to incidents and provide notification to regulators and otherwise, I mean, that's a crazy world to be thinking about living in, right? And so I think now with the technology that we have available to us, both in terms of monitoring the proposed and existing laws that go into effect, plus if you have a breach, being able to, use a service like Radar First, right? And input everything and click a button and it very quickly gives you, an analysis, right? Of how something, particular incident, looks from a, regulatory or legal standpoint. That's amazing, right? Compared to the way we used to have to do work before. And it's funny because a lot of people think of that in terms of, well, you're taking, work away from lawyers. I said, well, no, I think the way that I look at it is that sure, you take away some of the initial, I don't want to call it low level work, but, very much just fundamental, basic work. And then allow the time and effort to be spent on kind of the more strategic and important work that we oftentimes don't get to because we're mired in these things that take up a lot of time and we just need to do.
And what you're talking about in that particular thread, Nestor, is actually scale, right?
Yeah.
Technology, what you're describing is technology provides the efficiency of scale in this particular example. How do you scale when incidents and events are occurring at a more rapid pace and your volume of FTEs is maintaining a steady state?
Yeah.
So you have to leverage technology, or someone has to create technology to allow for the efficiency of scale to actually happen.
Absolutely.
So continue down the path. So we're talking about privacy. We talked privacy. It was manual. We're talking the privacy evolution. Technology has created an opportunity for efficiencies of scale and a whole other suite of benefits. Let's go bridge it into more current evolving regulations, cyber and artificial intelligence. Let's go deeper into that because as you stated earlier, 50% of your time is in the AI world. It has compliance ramifications. It has potentially cyber ramifications. It definitely has privacy ramifications. So let's go dig deep into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, a couple of things. It's really interesting to have conversations about AI nowadays because it's such the hot topic that people that maybe have absolutely no prior exposure to, data and what you can do with data and large language models, which have existed, for decades, are coming at this as a new thing, right? And so there's a lot of, I think, confusion and breathlessness associated with, oh my gosh, we need to come into compliance and all that, right? But I think for those of us that have been in the space for a while, we recognize that the laws that are being proposed in the AI space are really the culmination of all of this work that's happened over the years in the privacy, the cyber, even like right to repair laws and, that sort of thing. So when I look at them, it's twofold. One, I don't really am shocked by them because a lot of the aspects of them we've been dealing with for many years. But what I'm most concerned about, though, are the unintended consequences of these proposed laws. And so, candidly, that's where we spend a lot of our energy because a lot of the compliance aspects, if you will, of the cybersecurity and AI laws that are coming, they're coming into effect now or being proposed. We already have a lot of those things already from a control standpoint set up in our systems, right?
Sure.
To be able to comply with that. But I think the more difficult thing is the unintended consequences of these laws on the business operations. In other words, what you're able to do with the data, who you're able to do it with, and for what purposes, in spite of having, proper consents required by applicable laws. And so that's really where we're spending a lot of our time and energy, is just thinking through from an advocacy standpoint, to the extent that we can be able to educate policymakers and regulators that, there might be these unintended consequences that they're not really, thinking through because they're looking at it, from a purely academic standpoint, right? Yeah. And so, obviously there's a selfish intent in that on some level because you're a business and you want to maximize, the use of the data. But by the same standpoint, I also think there are a lot of benefits that the individual data subjects can receive from allowing companies to be able to use AI in certain places like healthcare, super critical area where AI plays a big role in figuring out what's the best treatment outcome or course of treatment for someone, right? So the difficult thing about this, though, Don, honestly, is that, there aren't a lot of laws in the AI space. I mean, the EU AI Act passed, earlier this year. Right. And, there are a bunch of laws that are in the works. My prediction is you'll likely see AI laws catch fire globally, like GDPR, triggered all these laws in other parts of the world. But the reality is we're just at the infancy, I think, of the AI specific laws.
Agreed.
But like I said earlier, I'm not super concerned about it because I feel like a lot of the components of AI law have already been, thought through in the privacy realm in particular, but also with, cyber laws and other data associated laws that are in existence.
I'm going to go deeper in one piece you said, but if you think about where artificial intelligence came from, it's been around for quite some time. Mm-hmm. Large enterprises have been leveraging artificial intelligence in some ways. So their corporate governance process exists or should exist in a very robust way, whether they're regulatory compliance obligations or not. But if you go backwards to just 2 years ago on the emergence of Gen AI, the reason why it's heightened is because everyone that has access to the internet now has access to AI in a way that was never shaped before. So that's why this at least my view is, that's why we're seeing the heightened level of scrutiny. We're seeing the heightened level of diligence. And then we're seeing almost a scramble to say, what do we do? And how do we not allow for unintended consequences to the benefit of business? Because I want to unpack that a little bit. You started talking about unintended consequences, but what you didn't give us is examples of what those unintended consequences could be. I have a lot in the back of my mind of regulatory legislation and what it could do to constrict organizations. So talk to me a little bit about that, because it's not just an organizational level, it could actually be at a countrywide level too, in terms of constrictions of the ability to innovate. Love to hear your thoughts on unintended consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just unpacking the statement I made, regarding certain really positive uses or possibilities with AI, and the reality is the lifeblood of AI is data, and so going back to the privacy world, it's critical to try to balance the rights that data subjects have with the potential to innovate and create real beneficial solutions for society, right? Yep. And so I think the unintended consequences I'm referring to primarily exist with limiting the data, right? And the uses of that data through AI that would then lead to these innovations and positive effects on society for fear of all of the bad things or the risks, right? Of things that could go wrong. So I think there's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction sometimes to focus on the negative. I think that's just a human thing, right? We can do 9 things right, but we're going to focus on the one that we feel like we did.
It's the one that gets the biggest headline, though.
Correct. And so when you think about AI, I think you hear a lot about the very valid risks that are associated with that, like hallucinations, like potential discrimination or bias in models and that sort of thing, right? Or, the apocalyptic view that we're going to turn into a real life version of Westworld, right? If we let these things
good show, by the way.
Right. It is. I'm so upset they canceled the last season before the whole story was told.
Totally agree. Yeah, it kind of left us all hanging. Yeah.
Right. I keep hoping that they'll bring it back at least for a movie. So we'll see. But we focus on those negative things without really thinking about all of the positive stuff. So it's really, I don't have any specific examples other than to say that if you limit the type and the use of data on the front end that you feed into these models, then I think the output, the innovations, the benefits to society are very much, held up, if you will.
Sure. No, they're kind of muted if you don't allow it to run. On the flip side, I can understand the arguments of if you let it run, then how are you governing any sort of drift in this AI model that sways responses into a very one-sided response rate? So it's a lot of work. But fascinating to watch how this is going to evolve over time. Let's go a little bit deeper. Let's shift the questions away from artificial intelligence and more into the future of technology, right? Mm-hmm. Just across the gamut of privacy, corporate compliance, cyber, and artificial intelligence. Technology, obviously, artificial intelligence is a technology in and of itself, but how do you see technology playing in a role of this regulations as they evolve? Because you talked about radar privacy, and I appreciate you plugging that one. Yeah. Where are holes in technology today that you can see in Nestor's experience that organizations are going to need to create and fill?
Yeah, the reality is technology is playing a more and more important role every single day within companies. Just thinking about every single department that could use some form of technology to, make more effective and quicker decisions and identify pain points or areas for improvement a lot quicker. So I would say that on the whole, the technology that exists is doing a pretty good job of doing that at a high level. I think where there's still opportunity for improvement or innovation is in specific areas, right? So like, for example, when you drill down beyond kind of like the high level of how is my department running from a financial standpoint to things like, how can I make sure that I am tracking and complying with all obligations in a certain space? And I know we're talking privacy, but the same exists in things like trade compliance or, just general compliance. If you happen to be in a highly regulatory and heavily regulated industry, like, financial services or healthcare, what have you. So I think the broad, if you will, approaches through technology are fairly well covered, but I think it's those deeper, more subject matter expertise type areas that I feel like still need to be fleshed out a bit more. It's a hard proposition, right? Because particularly if you're a company that's focusing in that area, you're taking a risk that there's actually going to be an appetite and need for that's long-term and sustainable. And so that might be, part of the reason why we don't see that in a lot of spaces per se. But I think that's one area that I think would behoove some companies to really look into and target doing more of.
I appreciate that. If you think about where technology can go, and I'll use the term niche areas because that's really what you're talking about in the subject matter expertise. There's a lot. There's this corporate compliance in terms of security frameworks. You can have a security framework. There is ESG reporting that every organization has to report in their 10Qs and 10Ks. How does that get distributed upwards into the audit committees and allow for consistent decisioning and documentation? There's a lot that's there that is very focused on the expanded regulations that are out in the world. And AI is going to be the next layer of this thing. So all this exists. And if you go backwards to SOX compliance, financial compliance, that's been around for a long time. That's pretty locked. They understand it. But now these new regulations are forthcoming that there's gaps in what technology can allow for and provide to. So there's documentation, there's consistency in decisioning, there's all those facets that technology can open the door for. And there's technology companies that will find and create solutions that will solve that. I can guarantee it.
Yeah.
Well, Nestor, one last question that I ask all my guests on Your Radar.
Yeah.
Nestor, what is on your radar for the future?
Yeah. So, for me, it really is about getting our arms around all of these evolving laws and where things are going. I think if you get too bogged down in trying to track every single thing that's out there, you just will never have enough people and time to do that. What I do with my team, and I think we do this more broadly within the company, is what are the trends, right? Almost trying to be a bit clairvoyant, if you will, of what is this environment going to look like 5 or 10 years from now, and start making whatever moves we feel are necessary now in order to best position ourselves, right? Not necessarily knowing, if you will, the details of what that will look like. And so I think there are a lot of general things, both from a, process, policy, control standpoint that, we start to do when we feel like things are headed in a certain direction. So I think for me, it's about synthesizing everything that's going on in the environment and trying to draw inferences from where things are headed. Sure. And start advocating to make those moves before they become an obligation that's thrust upon us with a very tight timetable for compliance. And I liken this to, several years ago when, China passed their various laws in cybersecurity, data security, and personal information protection. And a lot of companies struggled with, well, what do we do? Because it's not super clear how each of these different definitions, are meant to apply or what have you. And, I had to make an argument that we should invest, a certain amount of money in getting our systems ready, not knowing what the full extent was of how things would play out. Right. And so on some level, you have to, advocate for something that almost doesn't exist on some level. And it's difficult, but I think those conversations that you end up having with the leadership team are super critical, because this stuff is evolving at the speed of light. And I feel like if you just wait to see what happens and then react, you're going to be so, behind things that it would be very difficult to catch up. So I guess I just need to put on, my Karnak hat, right? And try to figure out what's in the envelope for 5 or 10 years from now.
Now, you let me know who's going to win the Super Bowl in 10 years, and then we'll both figure that one out. And maybe we'll retire younger than
yes, that'd be great.
One of the things you said, it's fascinating, is you're preparing for the future. Now, your history allows for you to actually have good insight into what's forthcoming. But if you think about what regulators want, no matter where they are in the world, they want consistency, they want a process. Yeah. If you could demonstrate you have that consistent process in place, you're going to be afforded a significant amount of grace from the regulators because you're ahead of the curve. And that is significant for all organizations to understand. And I know everyone of our listeners understands that, but sometimes we get caught in the weeds. So elevating yourself higher and saying, in 10 years, this could happen. Let me put the plumbing and infrastructure in place to future-proof what I need to future-proof for any evolving regulations and new laws that are going to come forward. Nestor, thank you for being on Your Radar podcast today. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It was great. And hopefully we can do this again in the future.
I plan on having you back. Absolutely. And to our audience, thank you for listening to On Your Radar podcast. On Your Radar is made possible by Radar First. Radar First automates intelligent decisions for your privacy and compliance regulatory obligations. If you'd like to learn more, please head to radarfirst.com. And if you enjoyed listening to today's podcast, please follow On Your Radar podcast. Our next episode will be available next month. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.